Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of the Word of the Day podcast, where useful words are pleasantly explained. My name is Jamie Silva, I am your host, and today I am joined in the RAV4 studios not by another of the talented voice actors you know and love, but rather by an honest-to-goodness fellow podcast host by the name of Brian Earl. Brian, thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Jamie. Thanks so much for having me.
Now, Brian, you host your own show, isn't that right? Why don't you tell the folks a little bit about that?
Yes, I'm the host of a podcast called Christmas Past, which tells the stories behind your favorite holiday traditions.
Now, folks, this is a top-notch podcast. I encourage all of you to check it out. And actually, it was episode 10 of Christmas Past that inspired this crossover episode, for reasons that'll become clear later. Okay, the word today is plum. Not the noun form, which we know as the popular fruit, but rather the adjective form. Plum is a little tough to define by itself, outside of the phrases where it typically appears, but basically it means special or superior, or among the best of its kind.
So if I said I got us some plum seats at the basketball game, you would know that these are excellent seats, perhaps in a box or maybe courtside.
And then let's say, when we were at the game, that I recommended you order some nachos because they come with this plum pepper jack cheese dip. Now, I do want to be clear, that does not mean that the dip is infused with plums.
And thank goodness. Instead, describing the dip as plum is just a way of saying that it's especially good, quite possibly among the best nacho cheese dips you'd find at any sporting event.
Right. Basically, things that are plum are going to be high quality or appealing or desirable in some way, possibly to the point that people could be jealous of you for having them.
Let's now turn to the official definition of plum, or at least the form that we're talking about. Quote, a highly desirable attainment, accomplishment, or acquisition, typically a job, unquote. Well, Jamie, this meaning sounds a little narrower than yours, right? I mean, nacho cheese doesn't seem like an accomplishment, and it's certainly not a job.
You're right, Brian. This definition is narrower than mine. Though I must point out that the dip would fit into the category of acquisitions, since before you eat it, you have to first acquire it from a stadium food vendor. But also, I don't know, I think I actually like the broader meaning. The versatility makes it more useful, and it matches up better with plum's history, which we'll get to in a sec. But this definition does correctly point out that very often nowadays, plum refers to jobs or positions, or occasionally responsibilities.
Indeed. So if you've ever heard someone talk about a cushy job, that's a really similar idea. These jobs are typically some combination of well-paid, easy, and fun.
So, for example, if I were paid a handsome salary to stay in someone's enormous mansion with like an Olympic-sized pool, a theater room, and a couple racquetball courts, and all I have to do is feed the fish in the koi ponds and perhaps take one of the Corvettes out for a spin now and again, I think that could be reasonably described as a pretty cushy gig, a sweet deal, or in other words, a plum job.
True enough. But folks, keep in mind that the perks don't have to be that extravagant, nor the job that easy in order for it to qualify as plum. Really, any highly desirable job or position will do.
Let's now take a look at the etymology. Originally, plum only referred to the fruit, and there was no adjective version. However, as time passed, plums grew more prevalent and popular. They were renowned for their sweetness, often served as dessert, and they could be dried to make prunes, or squeezed and aged to make wine.
Now, folks, you may think Jamie is leaving out the most famous plum-related food of all, plum pudding. This dish originated in early 1800s Britain and was usually prepared and served during the Christmas season. In fact, plum pudding is so closely associated with Christmas that it also goes by the name Christmas pudding.
However, these plum puddings actually had no plums in them. Raisins? Yes, lots of them. Currants, which are more or less raisins? Sure. Apples? Why not? No plums, though. This, we realize, is confusing, and I, for one, had always taken it as perfectly self-evident that plum pudding contained plums, and not just because it's right there in the name. As further evidence, I give you the following classic nursery rhyme that probably a lot of you heard as kids, or perhaps read to your own kids. Quote, "Little Jack Horner sat in the corner, eating his Christmas pie. He put in his thumb and pulled out a plum, and said, 'What a good boy am I.'"
Now, setting aside little Jack Horner's self-satisfied air and terrible manners, which probably explain why he had to eat in the corner, this seems pretty straightforward. You have the Christmas pie, which is a close cousin of Christmas pudding. You have the plum inside of it. Really, this seems like an open and shut case.
All very convincing, no doubt, and evidence does suggest plum pudding featuring bona fide plums was indeed a thing, at least for a while. But that was before Christmas pudding/pies were around, and by that time, plum could also mean a raisin. And basically, that's what plum pudding was, a raisin cake, with some other fruits and nuts thrown in for good measure.
Further confusing matters, plum could also refer to several other dried fruits, including figs. So in the popular Christmas carol, We Wish You a Merry Christmas, the part where the singers repeatedly and kind of rudely demand that someone bring them a figgy pudding and even refuse to vacate the premises until they get some, they're talking about raisin cake.
Huh. Honestly, if I was going to barricade myself in someone's house until they gave me a dessert, I'm not sure it'd be a raisin cake. But, well, to each their own.
Now, continuing with the etymology. Victorian Englanders didn't just expand the meaning of plum to include all of these dried fruits. They also used plum as just a general term meaning good or great or extra cool, presumably just because they liked plum so much.
If this went how I imagine it, back in those days, you probably couldn't go 5 minutes without hearing plum in some context. Like, oh, that's a real plum wagon over there. And look, it's carrying some plums. And also some plum pudding made with dried plums. That's super plum. Oh, and hey, you guys want to stop by the orchard later? I hear there are some real plum trees there.
Wait, plum trees? Like really superior trees with plums growing on them? Or just great trees of an unspecified variety?
Ambiguous, isn't it? Thankfully, since then, the meaning of plum as an adjective has narrowed some. It isn't just interchangeable with good or snazzy or cool. Rather, it refers to things that are super desirable or enviable, the best of their kind, etc.
Now, you may have heard plum in one other Christmas context, as part of the term sugar plum, which I discussed in episode 10 of my podcast Christmas Past. Sugar plums are celebrated in the famous poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, that begins "'Twas the night before Christmas," and also contains the couplet, "The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads."
Once again, the intuitive way to understand this is that sugar plums are plums, probably with some sort of sugar on them. And kids love sugary things. Ergo, the kids in this poem were simply hoping to receive some for Christmas. And so, of course, they dreamt of sugar plums.
And once again, the intuitive conclusion would be incorrect. Sugar plums actually had very little to do with plums when the term first popped on the scene in the early 1600s. Instead, sugar plum was a figurative term for something sweet or agreeable, especially stuff handed out as part of a bribe.
A few decades later, sugar plums started to refer to these little candies that had like a nut or a seed in the middle that was then encased in layer after layer of some sugary substance, which eventually formed into a small, hard candy. This may sound strange, but you may have come across a couple of these before. If you've heard of or tried Jordan almonds, for example, that's one type of sugar plum.
The finished product might look something like a plum, in the sense that they might be kinda spherical, or at least oblong, but the relationship ends there. The main idea is that sugar plum was a catch-all for sweet, sugary treats, or, figuratively, good things.
Fans of the ballet The Nutcracker by the Russian composer Peter Tchaikovsky may recall the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, who rules over the so-called Land of Sweets. This isn't because sugar plums are the best sweets, but rather because, again, the concept of sugar plums could encompass all kinds of desserts and candies. So it just made sense to have the person in charge of, or representing it all, be associated with sugar plums.
Now, while no one uses sugar plum in this sense today, or really at all as it's essentially obsolete, it's still instructive to see how it relates to today's word plum. Both seem to involve plums, but actually don't. And both have this broad meaning that includes all sorts of appealing or delicious things.
Okay, let's now turn to a couple examples of how to use plum in ordinary conversation or writing. Example number 1. After making friends with his boss, Calvin was assigned the plum responsibility of divvying up all the cubicles amongst his fellow employees. This allowed him to secure the one closest to the vending machines, which meant he was perfectly placed to get out in front of the mad dashes to the break room that occurred whenever the maintenance crew came by and placed on the counter all the chips and drinks that had passed their sell-by dates and were now free for whoever was alert and fleet of foot enough to snag their favorite.
Example number 2. Thanks to the hours they spent each week watching Taylor Swift videos, sharing Taylor Swift-related social media posts, and buying Taylor Swift merchandise, Vanessa and Megan were able to score plum backstage passes for one of her upcoming concerts. Happily for the Taylor Swift media empire, this inspired the pair to spend even more hours doing all of those same things.
Okay, that is it for the examples, but before we go, I want to give a quick shout out to another word, which is just plum spelt with a B at the end. Since the B is silent though, it's pronounced exactly the same. Google lists a few meanings, but all of them are boring, and none of them feature the sense I remember from my childhood. See, I recall Plum appearing in the Amelia Bedelia books, which document the lovable hijinks of an aspiring housemaid who has a tough time following instructions, mainly because she takes figures of speech literally and is also easily confused by homonyms.
Homonyms, by the way, are words that sound or are spelled the same but have different meanings. So, for example, when Amelia Bedelia's employers, Mr. and Mrs. Rogers, tell her to draw the drapes, meaning close them, she goes out and gets a sketch pad and draws them with a pencil.
Or, instead of making a cake with dates in it, dates as in the fruit, she finds some scissors and a calendar, clips out a bunch of dates from it, and dutifully mixes them into the cake batter.
Now, typically, the word plum, plum with a B, appears near the end of each story. When Amelia Bedelia, who earlier on had put a tasty baked good of some kind in the oven, declares that she plumb forgot her cupcakes, or whatever it was, and rushes to take them out before they've burnt to a crisp.
Which, to my memory, they never are. And instead, the pastry is so delectable that it restores Amelia Bedelia to the good graces of the previously disgruntled Mr. and Mrs. Rogers. Now, I think the best way to understand the phrase, I plumb forgot my cupcakes, is like, I completely forgot my cupcakes, or I straight up forgot, or there is no other way to put this and no getting around it, those cupcakes definitely slipped my mind.
What makes plumb such a useful word is that people forget things all the time, and exclaiming, I plumb forgot my homework, or I plumb forgot to add more quarters to the parking meter, etc., is a great way to express how thoroughly you forgot something.
All right, everyone. I think that'll do it for both forms of plum and for this episode. Thank you all very much for listening, and Brian, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a real pleasure.
Well, thanks for having me on, Jamie. This was a lot of fun.
And folks, remember to find Brian's fantastic podcast, Christmas Past, on iTunes and wherever fine podcasts are downloaded. For now, though, this is Jamie Silva saying so long from the RAV4 studios. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.